Hello, welcome back to Energy 101. This is the module that's continuing on U.S. energy independence. Energy independence has gotten a lot of press lately for several reasons. Some of it due to the fact that we've got some new oil finds with the Bakken and other oil shale and gas shale, and people, you see a lot of stories that maybe we can gain energy independence now that we're producing more oil and gas. I want to make sure we look at the facts on all that, and today I want to look at some of the issues regarding what we mean by energy independence and then what the numbers are. Where did energy independence come from? Well, I happen to be old enough to remember the origin of the word energy independence. It came from the OPEC embargo, which I mentioned before but hadn't noted the specifics, in October 1972. And it lasted until March 1973. The reason that we were embargoed by OPEC is the fact that the Yom Kippur War broke out, and Israel was marching and forward, and the U.S. was supporting them in some ways, and OPEC decided their only way they could stop Israel was to embargo the U.S. And so they embargoed the U.S. for any oil sales in October 1972. That was 40 years ago. It is amazing how it crippled our society. Our gasoline stations were forced to be open only from 8 o'clock during weekdays till 5 o'clock in the afternoon. They could not be open in the evenings or at night, and they could not be open on weekends. You could only fill up with gasoline in your car on even odd days depending on your license tag. So it caused lots of disruptions, long gasoline lines. There were mandatory building temperature settings in public buildings like universities or any building open to the public, so that the temperatures had to be set down to 68 degrees in the wintertime and had to be 76 degrees in the summertime. So it was really crippling to our economy. It was crippling to our way of life. It was crippling in many ways. And as a result of that, President Nixon, president at that time, and every president since then, every single president since then, has set energy independence as a goal. So we wanted to be independent to never be in that situation again. And my personal view, when I look at all the information, says I'm not sure we can be 100% certain that it cannot happen again. But let's look at some numbers. Let's look at the progress that we made since we had the first embargo in 1972. OPEC was importing, or we were importing 2.2 million barrels per day of oil, not just from OPEC, from everybody, including Canada and Mexico, and which was 19% of the oil that we used. So we were importing 19% of our oil, and which amounted to 2.2 million barrels per day. In the end of 2011, and all my data, by the way, is to the end of 2011. I don't like to take monthly data because it creates a lot of chaos and it's hard to establish trends. But the end of 2011, we were importing 8.9 million barrels per day, and which constituted 61% of our oil. Now, some of this that we've noted before comes from Canada, and some from Mexico, which hopefully is a little more stable, but that still has a tremendous economic impact. As I've noted before, those 8.9 million barrels per day cost us almost $350 billion in a year, $350 billion. You stop and think about it, that's half the cost that it took to bail out Wall Street. That money actually stayed in this country, whereas this money is going out of the country to others and creating jobs elsewhere. So there's major impact here. So we obviously have been going backwards by almost any measure you want to use of being independent from never being dependent on any one source of oil external to the U.S. Well, maybe it's because we're not drilling. Some people say we're not drilling hard enough and actively enough. Well, let's look at some data there. Let's take Saudi Arabia as a good example, because Saudi Arabia produces actually more oil than we do, as you see here. They produce 11 million barrels per day is how many barrels of oil they produce. And the active drilling rigs that they have actively drilling are about 50. It varies between 30 to 50 over the years, but right now it's about 50. It doesn't dramatically go up and down. Percentage-wise it does, but relative to the U.S. it doesn't. Well, look at what the U.S. situation is. We produce half the oil, 5.5 million barrels per day in 2011, and we have 1,500 active drilling rigs. So we're drilling a heck of a lot. We are using 30 times more drilling rigs than Saudi Arabia and getting about 1/2 the oil. Now, it didn't used to be that way. The reason that this situation it has occurred is because we have explored our land and even the near offshore since for about 100 years for oil. And it's a finite resource. Anything you say about it, it is a finite resource. There's only so much down there. You can argue about how much is down there, but it is a finite endowment. And when you spend the endowment, there's not anything left. But the problem is that the more you drill and the more you get out, the more difficult it is to find the remaining oil. I make the analogy that it's like burying volleyballs and ping pong balls in the sand on the beach. And when you are poking your stick around looking for each ball, whether it's a ping pong ball or a volleyball, and assuming each of them contains oil, which is what you're after, you're going to find the volleyballs first. And so we have found most of the volleyballs, but now we have to look for the ping pong balls, and those are more difficult to find and obviously have much less oil in them. So that's why we're having to drill a lot more than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been producing oil and exploring for their oil over a much shorter time period, like from 1940 on or 1930s on, where we've been doing it for 100 years. So we are actively drilling for oil. We can always drill more, no question. We can always drill more. But that's some comparison between us and the country that produces more oil than any other country in the world. Energy independence, that we noted before, we've seen this graph before, is still about oil. The red, what we got here is crude oil in the first bar, natural gas in the next bar, natural gas liquids, and coal and renewable. It's just to remind us that the red is the import, and the blue what we produce. You notice that oil is the import problem, and natural gas is about 15% imported, and that essentially all comes from Canada. So oil is the problem. Energy independence is about oil. And it's not about anything else. But some people say with our natural gas production, we can become energy independent. But natural gas is not oil. But let's look at what has happened to our natural gas production. We've seen this in a little bit different form previously, but this is the natural gas production from 1949 on the bottom scale out to 2011. And it's TCF, trillions of cubic feet per year. And you can see that we just passed the peak that we had in about 1972 or 3, which happens to be the same time we peaked in oil production in this country. And so we are increasing our natural gas production. How much is all relative. It's when you look at it here in perspective, you can see the increase out there on the right-hand side. Let me point it here, right here. So it is growing, but how far it'll grow and how fast it'll grow is is a prediction. And one of my favorite quotes about predictions, the only time predictions get you into trouble is when they're about the future. So we hope they're going to continue to increase. But how much we can substitute them for oil is another situation that we'll address in a few minutes. But how much oil do we have? Well, we have a lot of hype about the shale gas that we're getting and how much is there and what the potential is. And there was a huge boost in the gas reserves that were predicted and by U.S. Energy Information Agency, which is the division of DOE that accumulates data, and this pretty hard data that they collect, pretty firm data. But when you get the reserves, it's not exactly a science. It's a lot of art to it. But they over-predicted by their own admission, and they admitted it in 2011, of how much gas they could get from these new gas shale formations. They actually cut the reserves that they predicted, they estimate, is in the shale gas from 827 to 482 TCF. Now, 827 would be 40 years worth of gas, and 482 is 20 years worth of gas. And of course, you don't just keep increasing it, and then all of a sudden one day you can't get any more. It peaks and starts dropping off because it becomes harder and harder to get the second half out than it was the first half, just like the ping pong balls and volleyballs. So shale gas is certainly a good new supply, and it's increasing our natural gas production and future production, but exactly how much is yet to be known. We can predict it and we can guess at it, but it's hard to get a firm number on it that's believable and you can count on. Another thing that I've learned over my life is that things are never as good as they first appear, but they also are not as bad as they first appear. So hopefully we can hit a happy medium there. But one thing we have to realize, there are no silver bullets for energy independence. And I've just pointed out a few negative things here that say it's going to be difficult to reduce our oil consumption or imports down to a point where it won't hurt us if somebody, particularly the larger nations like Russia and Saudi Arabia are two prime examples, were to quit selling us oil or pull it off the world market. That's what would hurt us, and it would hurt everybody. The whole world would go into a deep recession if Russia or Saudi Arabia quit exporting any oil. It would be very difficult. So there are no silver bullets. We have to do a lot of things, and we'll talk about some of those things in the future that we'll see you next time. And the next module, as a matter of fact, is about electric cars displacing oil. One of the shotgun pellets, not necessarily a silver bullet. Thank you.